Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're excited to have everyone here, and thanks for joining us for our wealth panel discussion on asset and estate protection. A little different focus than what we had last year, where it was kind of focused on tax planning and estate planning. This year, we want to focus a bit more on asset protection. I'll tell you what that means in a few minutes. Pat's advised me there are some things that I've got to do, and he's already got a checklist that if I miss something, I'm going to be in trouble. One, I can't talk for 20 minutes. That's going to be tough. Second of which is, we do have a couple of big events coming up at Stonebridge, and one of which is on September 1st, we're going to be in a new office. And we're excited to tell everybody about this, right? We're going to stay in the Court International building where we've always been, but we're moving up to the 4th floor. They're almost at the point of completing it, and I don't know if the Grotkins are here yet or not. R.J. Ryan is doing the work for us. We're thrilled to have him do it. They're doing a fabulous job, and Heidi and Michelle have been coordinating that whole deal. We're taking on a space that's a little more than twice the size that we have now, and we're going to see if we can fill it up with as many talented people as we're fortunate to work with today. So we invite you to visit us. It opens on September 1st. We'd love to show you around, and so it's going to be an exciting event for us. On September 12th, we have our Advisor and Client Appreciation event, and all of you are welcome. We say advisor and clients, but certainly other guests are welcome to join us. This year we're going to have it in Golden Valley, at the Golden Valley Country Club. We simply kind of ran out of space last year at the Minneapolis Country Club, and of course, we used to do it right here in St. Paul, but we needed more space, and it's just going to be a great event, opening with economic and market commentary with Dan Laufenberg early before the event actually begins. I think that's going to be around 4:30. And then the event cocktail reception starts around 5 o'clock, and from there we'll be enjoying dinner and conversation. So if any of you are interested in joining us, if you haven't joined us before, you're welcome to do so. It's been a really enjoyable event. Now, with that said, just a quick intro relative to what we're going to do tonight. We have some really talented folks that we work with a fair amount with our clients, and they're going to come up here and be a part of the panel, and I'll introduce them here shortly. But last year, as I said, we focused on estate planning and tax planning. This year, you'll hear some of that as well. But one of the most important jobs that we have at Stonebridge as your investment manager is to protect your assets. And that sounds sort of weird because you say, oh, you're an investment manager, you should be growing our assets. Indeed, we should. But there are times in a market, there are times with investments that it's more important that we protect you from the downside than it is to give you more of the upside. In fact, we might be nearing one of those situations in the market right now. Could this be the top of a market that's run now for almost 11 years? Could be. I want to talk about the ways that we protect your assets at Stonebridge, but also how your assets are structured to protect you from liabilities that could be out there, particularly if you have rental properties, you have properties in other states. We want to make sure that any potential liability from a lawsuit that could happen, from an accident that happens on a rental property. Also protect your estate to make sure that those properties go to the people or organizations that you want them to go to. And we also want to make sure that those properties and assets that you have that could be anywhere from art to automobiles to houses to apartments, you name it, that those assets are protected properly with the right insurance for that particular property. And then how they're structured to provide you with that protection. So we're going to talk about all of the aspects of asset protection for you today and how that might apply to you. The case study that we're going to use today may not necessarily apply in total to your life. We have a slightly different case study than we used last year. But we figured we'd make this as broad a case study as possible so that you could get a sense of something that might be impactful to your lives or assets that you have in your lives that you may need to think about in terms of your estate plan, asset protection, and transfer upon death or gifting. So we want to make sure that we have that in mind. And we also want to make sure that those of you who are of charitable minds, some alternatives that would be available to protect those assets and transfer those assets in charitable giving or structures that would be set up to do so as well. So that's the long and the short of it. I'll quickly go introduce our team. I'll let them come on up and sit down, and then I'll introduce everybody. So come on up, folks. Is this the best way to go, or you want to go that way? Okay. Yeah, okay. That's what I thought. Well, I'm pleased to introduce you to our panel, some of who you may have met in prior years. To my left is the ever lovely and talented Lori Hume, who is remotely related to a fellow by the name of Ron Hume here, and you may know that guy. I'm not shy about saying that Lori is if not the top tax accountant in town, she's certainly one of the close top in that field, and we've been fortunate to use her as a resource in many tough situations, and has really been a great person. Now she is semi-retired from Whipfleet, and she did so not much longer than a month ago. So we're thrilled to have her up on the stage with us. And to her left, Doug Wolgamot. Doug is a estate planning attorney with Winthrop Weinstine. It's a firm that we're fairly close to because they are our legal counsel as well. And Doug is on the estate planning side, and quite frankly has helped Laura and I out a little bit with some of our work too. And so we're thrilled to have Doug for the first time with us. And to the left of Doug is Tiny Brown. Brownie, or Mark Brown, is Brownie as we love to call him, but Mark Brown is Vice President at Aon Private Risk Services, and with a very, very specialized expertise on the insurance side, protecting your assets. Mark has worked with us on a number of cases in the past. In fact, started the conversation with us last year when out from the audience. I had some questions that popped up, and I thought, there were enough questions that popped up. It was well worthwhile to have Mark come back, particularly on this subject matter. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.
Now, it's making me feel good standing up because I'm kind of vertically challenged, so I guess I'll sit down so I'm kind of at a level with everybody else. But let me walk through the case study for you so that you have a sense of what we're looking at, and they're up on the screens right now. If you can't see it as well as you'd like to, let us know if you have questions specifically about. So we chose a family. The wife is a surgeon, a partner in a clinic with an ownership interest of about $2 million in that clinic. Her income is $600,000 a year. Her husband, who's 60, owns a manufacturing company. It's an S-Corp with an ownership interest of $5 million and an income of $400,000 a year. There are 3 children, a son who's 30 years old, married with 2 children, a daughter, 27, engaged to be married, and a daughter, 24, a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. Now, relative to the residences or the real estate that they own, their primary residence is Minnesota. So they're Minnesota residents with a value of about $2 million. Their cabin in Minnesota is owned by the husband. The house is owned jointly, but the cabin is owned by the husband independently. $550,000 value. They have a rental property in Florida owned by the wife with a value of $1.5 million. They have a condo in Wisconsin that they bought for their daughter to live in while she's going to school, and also has some roommates, so it's a rental property as well with a value of $250,000. Their investment portfolios, they have an investment accounts in their names independently. So the wife has one and the husband has one solely in their names. Wife's value is $500,000 and husband's value is $750,000. Their 401k, the wife has is $750,000 and the husband's is $875,000. She has a cash balance plan, which is essentially a pension plan, with a value of roughly $1.3 million. They both have life and disability policies. They also own some autos, boats, jewelry, 4 vehicles, husband and wife, daughter in school, and 1 at the Florida residence. There are 3 boats, 2 in Minnesota, 1 in Florida, and the Florida boat is a part of the rental property that they have. Value of about $600,000. Jewelry and collectibles of about $400,000. And currently, they both give to their charities a contribution of roughly 1% of their annual income on an annual basis. So as I say, some of this may pertain to you, some of it may not, but we hope you can pick out the aspects of it that make sense relative to your lives and be able to, and we welcome you at some point in time to ask a question that may pertain to you. But I think what we'll start the process with is by kind of outlining, we've outlined the situation, and now just want to start with some questions for the panel, and then eventually I'll give you the opportunity to jump in and ask the questions as well. So I'm going to start with Doug, and it might kind of fall into all three of the panel members. But as we look at the structure of this family and the assets that they own, Doug, much of which is held in their names solely, how would you recommend putting those assets together in a different structure to help protect them and also do a little bit of estate planning along those lines?
Yeah, so this is a really relevant topic when we talk about estate planning with our clients. You can't do that without talking about asset protection planning. It's a part of every conversation that we have. And so really what we're looking at when we're having those conversations is, what can we do in terms of ownership structure? What can we do in terms of how you hold title to your assets to protect, those assets if something bad would happen? And I would say the first thing we talk about is insurance. I mean, that's, in almost every case, that's going to be your first avenue of defense, regardless of what the structure is. So first and foremost, I'd say go talk to Mark or someone like Mark, because if something goes wrong, that's the first place you're going to look. But secondly, we start looking at, where are your areas of biggest risk? And so in this fact pattern, I'd say it's the cabin, it's the rental real estate, it's the toys, it's the sort of things where people can get injured, where people, may have a lawsuit if something would happen on the property or with your boats or toys or what have you. And so on the legal side, oftentimes what we're doing is we're saying, how can we structure that to limit your liability? So if you own those properties in your individual name and something bad would happen, let's say there's a lawsuit, there's an injury at the cabin, all of your personal assets are fair game. If there's a lawsuit, they're going to be able to come after the value of your investment assets, kind of everything on your personal balance sheet. And so the most common way for us to structure the estate plan there would be to create a limited liability entity, so an LLC or a partnership or a corporation. Most commonly, that would be an LLC. And we would have that entity take title to the cabin, take title to the Florida property. And that way, if something bad would happen and there's a lawsuit, that creditor that's trying to come after your assets is limited to the value of the assets in that entity. So in that example, the cabin or the Florida property. And so that would be the most common method for us to structure that. And oftentimes we would do that with separate LLCs. And the reason for that is if you put both properties into the same LLC and something happens, well, they're going to say, what's the value of that LLC? Well, it's both properties now. And so what we like to do is to create, separate entities, a separate one for the cabin, a separate one for the Florida property. And so if something happens in Florida and there's a lawsuit, they're coming after the value of the Florida property, but they can't get at the value of the Wisconsin cabin.
So you're looking at different LLCs for the properties. And you've talked with Mark, presumably, about the insurance structure of that. Mark, is that kind of like how you folks on the insured side of the business like to see things structured? And talk a little bit about the insurance that you might recommend for a situation like that.
Well, from a personal insurance perspective, we would rather see the assets in their personal name. It makes the insurance companies a little more comfortable from understanding the risks and getting an insurance and umbrella over the risks. But from a practical standpoint, my clientele comes from people like Doug who do these things, puts the Florida property into an LLC. It's a rental property. We can structure programs. Obviously, you could write that Florida property in its own LLC, or you can add the LLC to a personal insurance program to give it some coverage limits and things of that nature. So at the end of the day, we're going to take what the estate planning attorneys put together and craft a personal insurance program to cover all the different entities, the trust, the partnership. But you have to have an insurance company that understands that, and that's where the tricks start to come into play. From a tricky perspective, but most insurance companies don't understand when you put a property into an LLC. They don't want to understand the risk. It's not a personal risk. It's owned by a company. It's an LLC. Well, no, it's only an LLC designed to protect the assets. So when that's the case, you have to have a personal insurance company that understands the risks and is willing to take the risk and absorb it into your program. And there are companies that do that, but there are a lot of companies that don't do that. They'll refer you out to other companies that will do it. In our world, you know, I work for companies like Chubb, AIG's Private Client Group, Pure, Cincinnati, Berkeley One are my 5 primary markets. They don't bat an eye at those kind of things. It happens every single day. It just becomes an additional interest in their personal program. So the home in Florida may be insured in Mark and Rochelle's name, and we would add the Brown Family LLC on as an additional insured, and it gets covered by our umbrella, and everything's happy. It protects what Doug just did all the work on to build that program, and it creates the insurance program to protect that asset, and it protects the LLC as well as it protects the individual that owns the LLC.
So we put these properties in different LLCs. We have them protected by insurance. When you do all of that, Lori, from your perspective, does that impact the tax status of those entities once they're kind of put together in these LLCs, say on their personal tax returns?
If they're single-member LLCs or just the husband and wife, you know, it would end up on their individual return most likely anyway. And then you're taxed for the rental property. Florida doesn't have an income tax, so you'd pay Minnesota rates on your net rental income anyway. At some point in time, if you sold the Wisconsin condo that the daughter lives in, you would pay any capital gains tax in Wisconsin, but then you'd get a credit on Minnesota. So it does complicate it a little bit, just how it's titled. But again, depending on the ownership structure, a lot of it probably is still embedded in your individual return.
I would say that, you know, that's a great example, Mark, of the reason to have your whole advisory team involved in the planning process, because oftentimes what we're suggesting on the legal side has implications on the insurance side. It may have implications on the lending side. So if you have mortgages on your cabin, like in this example, or on the Florida property, well, the loan documents you signed are almost certainly going to say you can't go transfer ownership without asking the bank first. And so it is a process of saying, let's figure out what the game plan is and make sure that it works from everybody that's at the table to come to the best result. But those are the 2 most common issues that we encounter is, you know, we recommend you put this cabin or the Florida property into an LLC, and you say, well, we have a mortgage on it, so how do we deal with that? Couple options: you can call your banker, and the bank may be willing to consent to that. From my experience, if you have an LLC that owns the property, the rate you're going to get on a mortgage is going to be typically a little bit higher than if you were doing that individually. So it is a bit of a trade-off to decide if, you know, is the protection you're afforded by using that LLC structure worth maybe the additional cost. If there's no mortgage, you don't have that issue. But again, on the insurance side, it's the same issue, making sure that your insurance agent or insurance, you know, broker can accommodate having that ownership structure to make it all work. But if you figure it out on the front end with the whole advisory team involved, it really makes getting the entire process completed much simpler.
I would add in as a trigger, people, Doug, when you do that, when you change the title of something, you just change the insurability of that asset. And that triggers a conversation.
Right. So whether it's your insurance or your lender or anything else, it's going to trigger a change. Yep.
You know, in my line of work with the clientele that we have, it's very important for me to be in front of my clients annually to be asking the question. Because from a structure standpoint, so many people structure assets with Doug and put things in different entities. They don't, as much as Doug will tell them, hey, you need to get your insurance broker involved or your State Farm agent or whoever it is, they don't call them. They walk out of the lawyer's office, they got their documents, they're good to go. Oh yeah, I'm going to call them tomorrow, and they play golf or they go to the cabin and they forget all about to make that phone call until somebody like me sits down and says, hey, have you done any estate planning this year? Well, yeah, I moved that Florida property into an LLC because, we're going to put it in a VRBO, and And, most insurance agents would smack their forehead and go, oh boy. But the reality is there's ways to get it done. You just have the right people to do it for you.
Our role oftentimes when we meet with our clients is to kind of get a picture of what the situation is. And so oftentimes we're asking our clients, can you explain your assets? We want to take a look at all of your assets. We also want to look at your liabilities, which are up here as well, so that when we get to this broader planning stage of how do we protect your assets, then it allows us to ask you, can we meet with your attorney, your accountant, your insurance provider, whoever it may be, or if you need us to help you put a team together so that we can really hit this in a very comprehensive fashion. And again, for the objective of protecting your assets. And I'll try to take this story to a little bit more dramatic level. We have a client, happens to be based in Tennessee. He's a very wealthy gentleman, he and his wife are. Asset values of somewhere around 10 or 15 million. He owns a number of rental properties. For years, we've been trying to get him to get together with his attorney and talk about how he needs to structure his assets to protect him first from liability, and then two, to set up his estate plan. All of his assets, whether it's real estate or investment assets, are held in his name solely. Well, as Doug might say, well, one, he's probably got a probate issue if something happens to him, number one. Number two, he has real estate down in Florida that he rents on a regular basis, and it's right on the ocean. It's a beautiful place. They have families going in and out of there all the time. One particular weekend, they have a family in there. And as you know, sometimes these condos have a window or a sliding door on the ocean side and then a front door that they kind of come in and out of. And when you have both of them open, it creates a wind tunnel. 2-year-old kid there. When door closes, loses a finger. Now, that's a dramatic situation, but it's not too that dramatic that it can't happen at any point in time. He is now in court debating about what they want and whether or not they're going to collect on it. His entire portfolio of assets is open to that liability. Now, he's got an insurance company that's supporting him on this, but I don't know how far they're able to do that. And Brownie, you may have a different point of view on that. But, so his assets, all of his assets are subject to liability. And so that's why Doug is recommending, let's narrow that liability to the asset that's based in Florida, in that individual LLC. We touched on this subject, and both Lori and Doug may have an opinion on it. As you notice, many of the assets are held in their name individually, and we did that purposefully. But I guess the first question that comes out of this is, tax-wise, it probably doesn't make that much difference because they're probably filing a joint return.
Correct.
Is that right? But we always concern ourselves, and it's kind of tough for us to do this, but it's our job. It's like, okay, what happens if something happens to one or the other? Are those assets going to be subject to probate? And some of these assets, as you can see, are in other states. Any perspective?
So let me touch on two things there. So the first one is sometimes clients say, well, should I, for example, we've got a doctor for one of the spouses. And so clients, well, can I do things to protect assets if it's more likely that the doctor would be sued because of that profession? And I describe asset protection planning as a continuum, not as a black and white. So you can never truly say something is totally protected, but it's more a matter of, degrees. It's how difficult does your plan make it for a creditor, difficult and expensive for that creditor to get at whatever assets they're trying to get at. And so sometimes we will say if you've got one spouse in a profession that is riskier, we'll say, well, you could put some assets in the other spouse's name, and I think of that as sort of 1 degree of separation. It's one step towards asset protection. It's going to make it more difficult, more expensive. In the end, it may not, be the deciding factor, but it is something you can do, and then there are many other steps that can be taken along the way. Because almost every time we talk about asset protection, the question is, well, is it protected? Well, it's as protected as we can make it.
Right.
And then on the second point so probate, every state has its own probate court, and that court's job is to deal with assets that someone owns in their individual name at the time of their death. So for clients who own real estate in different states, you end up having a probate in your state of residency, and you have an ancillary probate, a probate in every state where you own real property. So one of the pretty simple things we can do with estate planning is structure ownership of real estate and other assets so those probate proceedings can be avoided. So, probate is complicated. it's just kind of, it is what it is. And it's probably at a minimum $5,000 to $10,000 per state you're going to be in. And so it's really pretty simple through, through deed work or transfer on death deeds, or most commonly the use of revocable trust as the primary estate planning document, to structure assets on the front end so all of the assets, including the real estate, can completely bypass going through that probate process, which again is, there's a delay to it, it takes a long time, technically it's a public proceeding, and your estate has to pay for it. And so that's another simple one, is to say if you have out-of-state real estate, let's look at how that's structured so that you can avoid probate down the road.
The family has a value of about $15 million, and so it begs the question whether or not they could potentially be in a state tax situation federally, or for that matter, could they be in an estate tax issue here in the state of Minnesota, be they residents here? General ideas on that?
So they would not be subject to federal estate tax, because every person now has an $11,400,000 exemption. So you don't have to worry about that. Minnesota in 2020 will be up to a $3 million exemption per person. It's $2.7 million this year. So they would be subject to Minnesota estate tax. And essentially estate tax is the tax on the value of your estate at the date of your death. So the value of your assets, less your liabilities, less some other costs that you're able to take at that point in time, like fees you're paying for estate work, etc. So a couple things you could do to help minimize the Minnesota estate taxes. You'd want to make sure that in using your estate attorney like Doug, that you've set up your trusts in a way that each of you are maximizing and using your $3 million Minnesota exemption. For instance, you wouldn't want one spouse to leave everything to the other spouse outright. You would want to make sure you had that marital trust set up to use their $3 million exemption. And the spouse could still have access to the money for health, maintenance, and welfare, but it would not end up in their estate. And then another way to help reduce estate taxes would be if you had any charitable bequests in your estate plan. One thing we see often, or have seen, I guess often maybe is a little strong, is that someone comes in, we're working on their spouse or their parents' estate tax return, and they'll say, but I know mom or dad wanted money to go to whatever their favorite charity. But the legal documents don't say that, and so you can't do it unless the legal documents say it. And then usually the answer is, well, you can inherit the money then, and you can turn around and make the donation if you know mom and dad wanted that and you want to honor that. But you can't, it has to be in those documents. So kind of back to a point both Doug and Mark made earlier is not only do you have to have your documents the way you want them, but then you have to, whether it's naming your bank accounts and your it's an arduous process, getting your accounts renamed, retitled to match your documents. But again, that can be a very big, can be problematic sometimes on the back end, if that. So those are some of the things that you can do. Another thing is on the life insurance that they have. Presumably, at least in my mind, I was thinking that probably the life insurance on him might be left to her for keeping the business running or until they could sell the business, because there's a lot of liability there as well. But maybe her life insurance is not left to him, so eventually it wouldn't end up in his estate. And again, each situation is different, and if the purpose of the life insurance was to be able to buy out the business or to keep it running. So there are some things you can do to help at least maximize the tools that are out there. But Minnesota I'll just chime in. And
Sure.
everybody is death knell on Minnesota state taxes, right? It's just a bad, bad thing, and you hear that a lot of people are moving out of state because of it and changing their residency, and some do. I would just offer, if you're thinking of that, and New York and other states are very similar, that what we've seen in our practice is if you only do it for a tax reason, really, if you only do anything for a tax reason, you're probably not going to be happy with that decision. It does need to be part of your decision process, but I certainly know couples where grandma is feeling imprisoned down in Florida because she cannot be at her grandchildren's events because she has to count her days and stay out of the state. Or in a very extreme example, I had a couple and one wanted to be a Florida resident, one didn't, and it ended up costing the other one a lot more money because he went out and bought a very large boat, almost a yacht. So I don't think he saved any money in the long run. Maybe he had more fun, but I don't think he saved any money. So, you just got to really think through all that. And again, the tax piece, I say, is always part of the reason. But if that's the only reason that you're changing your family whole dynamics and structure and moving away, I would bet that you wouldn't be happy with it.
Let me think here now. Boat, state of Minnesota. Boat. It's a tough decision.
That's a tough decision. But anyway.
We did actually, we'll have out for you the requirements for changing your state of domicile from the state of Minnesota's perspective. And we do get this question from our clients a lot. And as Lori has aptly pointed out, you need to have a reason to move out of state that goes beyond your tax situation. And we'll do the research for those clients that are thinking of moving to wherever it may be. There's cost of living, there's other taxes that are involved, there's other issues that you're going to be dealing with on a personal basis. You may be moving away from your family, and what's it going to cost you to go back and forth? I mean, there's just a lot of things to take into consideration before you make that kind of a move. Yes, sir.
Okay, the question is, and again, it's more of a tax question, is that if your business is in Minnesota and your property is in Minnesota and you're generating income off of all that, does it make sense to leave the state of Minnesota, even though, you might want to live in Florida or international waters with your boat, et cetera, right? Does it make sense to leave the state?
It doesn't, because any income related to earnings for work done in Minnesota or your business in Minnesota is still going to be Minnesota taxable. So maybe your investment income would not be anymore. But if it's Minnesota-based income, and that goes to with executives, if they're getting deferred payments now from their companies, and that the right to earn that, the right to those benefits was earned while they worked in Minnesota, it's still going to be Minnesota taxable because you worked here and earned the right to those dollars when you were a Minnesota resident. So, and every state is really approaching that the same way. So there is less incentive in some ways than maybe 20 years ago when some of that tracing didn't apply.
Another question over here, Pat?
Can I just add one thing? That there is one exception. If the husband's going to sell his business,
Yes.
you can take steps, in anticipation of doing that, change residency and not have the sale proceeds subject to Minnesota tax.
I'll chime in too. From an insurance perspective, if you change your primary state of residence, you have to change your personal insurance to reflect that you are now, in most of my client situations, Florida. You have to change your home, your primary home is now have to be in Florida, which means your jewelry, your art, your umbrella, everything has to be rated based in Florida. And to go back to Bob's comment about expenses, you're going to add about 20 to 25% to what you spend annually is going to add on to your personal insurance right off the bat, because everything's more expensive down there.
Great. Yes, sir.
Okay, so I have a question. First off, I really like this wealth preservation, and really what you're focusing is inheritance, right? Passing it on.
To some degree.
To some degree.
Yeah.
So my father died last year, 93 years old, and roughly speaking, his estate, 15% of us, and you show a number up here of assets, and it's all in white, okay? And I'm an accountant, so I'm going to preview that, just to let you know. There's 3 colors up there. There's the post-tax, pre-tax, and tax preference. So I saw Heidi over the bar before, so that would be the bonds, where you're not paying income taxes on that. You've got your pre-tax, and you've got your post-tax assets. So my father died, and roughly 15% of his taxes were pre-tax of his assets. My wife and I have saved very diligently, and I looked at the end of June, and roughly 50% of our assets are now pre-tax. And we're in a substantial asset situation. So the question I have, and Lori, this is probably going to come to you, and this is what my concern is, that there's some legislation going on as far as 401k inheritance, IRA inheritance. And I don't know where this is. It passed the House, like 427-3, that any inherited IRA would have to be withdrawn within 10 years. Now, I'll be 61 this month. If I inherit an IRA, 10 years, I can understand. And I talked to my financial planner over here, who's my brother, okay? And I said, if my wife and I go down a plane crash right now on January 2nd of 2020, that my son, who is going to graduate next May, is going to inherit our IRA pre-tax information. He's going to be on Bernie Sanders' radar. He's the ultra rich, okay, from an income tax perspective. So have you looked at that as far as inherited IRAs? Where is this going to go? Do you have any idea, any recommendations to how to protect those pre-taxed assets above and beyond, given this potential legislation that's going to go through?
Well, usually I don't study potential too much other than the headlines, because what usually ends up in law is very different than what they're writing about now. But I think, to your point, I would be surprised to some extent. And certainly what he's referring to is that if a younger person inherits an IRA, and every situation's different. It depends if you're already over 70 and a half and you're taking your required minimum distributions or you're not. We won't get into all those details. But generally, if a younger person inherits an IRA, often they can take it out over their life expectancy. So you're 30 years old and you inherit your dad's IRA, you can take smaller amounts over time. You still could take it all at one time if you wanted, but hopefully you're listening to everybody who's telling you not to do that. So I don't know, and that would be a change that would force the younger people to take it out more quickly, obviously. And the whole thought process there is with IRAs, there's no step up in value when you inherit them because no one's paid tax on them. So whoever takes the money has to pay the income tax. So what they're trying to do is accelerate revenue for the IRS.
Revenue to the government.
revenue.
Yeah, it's not.
Tax
It's not revenue to you.
right.
Just
Tax
they've sold it as a
revenue.
revenue enhancement, but it is for Washington.
I don't know. I would guess, as I sit here today, I would be somewhat surprised if that actually got passed, because again, at any time, a person could take more if they wanted. There might be 10 years seems pretty short if they did make it to that. And really, the only thing I could think of that you could do is, I suppose one thing you could do is rearrange your estate planning and leave your IRAs, more of your IRA to charity. And leave other assets to the children or grandchildren. But short of, I guess, disowning your own family and leaving it to others, I don't know what you would do with that. I'd be somewhat surprised if that goes through. These things ebb and flow and get a lot of, and it might, but I don't really know what you could do. I'm sure anybody who's in that situation now would be grandfathered in, and then it, would change going forward.
I'm going to take us back here just for a second on the idea of establishing a trust to some degree to help this family with their estate tax situation. Some of you may be saying, well, we don't have an estate tax, right? I don't have it for Minnesota, and I don't have it on the federal side. Well, that's great. But I do have assets that I'm going to leave to my family. What does a trust do for me in that circumstance? Can you kind of draw your attention on that?
And this is probably the most common conversation. I have this conversation 4 times a week. Because clients come in, when they're new clients, they come in and they say, I have a simple estate, I just need a simple estate plan, and I'll agree with that, that's fine. But you need some level of complexity if you want to get the benefits that you can have from some of this planning. So probably the most common way that we structure assets to pass now to the second generation is to set them up in separate trusts that are created at the second spouse's death. So in the 5-10 years ago, it was pretty common to say if your kids are 35 years old, there's no, they're financially responsible, no reason to have an ongoing trust for them at that point. And the estate plan in the old days would have said, if they're 35 at that time, there's 2 kids, they each get half, and they, go their separate ways with the assets. Nowadays, what we typically see is an ongoing trust that's created as part of the estate plan that comes into place at the second death, and it holds those assets for the benefit of that adult child, even if they're, financially responsible. And again, this comes back to asset protection, because if that child inherits the assets individually, and now let's say they get married and then they get divorced, or let's say they get in a car accident and they get sued, all of those assets are on their personal balance sheet, all of those assets are fair game. If instead we utilize this ongoing trust, where all of those assets are there and for the benefit of that child, they can use them how they want, they can actually be the trustee of the trust where they're making the decisions. Now that same thing happens, they get divorced or there's this lawsuit, they have this shield of protection around those assets, those inherited assets. And again, that's pretty far down the continuum. It's pretty difficult for a creditor to try to attach to those assets now. But from the child's standpoint, it looks and feels just like they inherited them individually, because they can control and they can decide what happens. They can decide who to leave those assets to at the time of their death. And so as part of even a pretty straightforward estate plan, you can really offer, the children in the future a great amount of asset protection.
Hello.
In regards to real estate, if you own a property, if I own a property in my name, there's 1 to buy, 2 to sell. My wife has to sign off when I sell the property. How does that work? Because you're talking about owning, these people own several properties in his and her name, but I'm kind of confused as to how this tax business works with that type of ownership. Because I know in Minnesota, it takes 1 to buy, and like we have a son who may get married, and as soon as he marries, she doesn't have to sign anything. She automatically has an ownership in that property.
So I think there's maybe 2 questions there.
Yeah,
The
I
first
think
one
so,
is,
yeah.
on the tax side of things, we can structure this so it's identical to if you owned it individually. It can flow through to your personal or joint return in the same way as if you owned the property in your individual name or names. So that isn't really a difference. And then from the standpoint of who would ultimately have to sign off if there was a sale down the road, that's going to depend on kind of who controls it. Let's assume that you use that LLC. At that point, whoever is managing or is in charge of the LLC, presumably, again, that's you or both of you, that's who signs off at that time.
So that's just in the LLC. If you don't have an LLC, then because I've had a lot of clients that were divorced, and of course, you have to have the spouse sign off on that property.
Right.
Yeah.
But
So it's not necessarily going to change what would happen in a divorce. Just because the spouse has to sign off when it goes into the LLC, the fact that you've put it in there doesn't necessarily mean that that's protected from a subsequent divorce in that case. But it does depend on who would then have to sign off in terms of selling it later.
we hear this term, and it might be helpful for some. We talk about an umbrella insurance, Mark, and might be curious as to what exactly that means and what amount should one have given a certain set of circumstances.
Well, as you apply to these people, obviously they've got a lot of exposures and a lot of moving parts. Everybody in this room should have an umbrella. Don't kid yourself. At the end of the day,
It's a perfectly sunny day outside. What do you
well, exactly. So the umbrella insurance policy sits over the assets that are listed underneath it and provides an added layer of protection from a financial lawsuit before they can even get to a single penny of your assets. Most people would say, well, I'm worth $2 million, I should have $2 million. I would tell you hogwash. That's just the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You buy a limit of liability so they can't get through to your assets. Whether you're worth $14 or you're worth $48 million, it doesn't matter. If you have a $5 million umbrella, it takes a $5 million lawsuit to get through to your assets, okay? And if you have a $3 million umbrella, what you do is you create a circle of protection with that umbrella limit, and the thicker, the higher the limit it is, the more probable they can never get through it. And they're not suing you, they're suing your insurance company. And you pay for that protection. And one of the greatest features of a personal umbrella policy that you wouldn't think of is to protect from the legal fees. And when you have an umbrella, the insurance company pays all the legal fees separate of the limit. They don't erode the limit of liability whatsoever. So a $5 million umbrella is truly set aside to protect the claim of 5 or 4 or whatever the number is, and the legal defense is absorbed by the insurance company. And the legal defense alone could cost you more than what the settlement is. And in these situations, we get into LLCs and trusts. When you structure a program and you have the homes and it's owned by this LLC or a trust, when you list it all under your personal umbrella, the LLCs and the trusts all flow right up into the umbrella and get the same limit of protection that you individually get. They're not separate limits, it's just total. So if they were to come after the Mark Brown Family Trust or the Irrevocable Trust, they would also have the same $5 million limit of coverage that I would have individually. And so when we talk about asset protection and getting your team together and assembled, we're going to take all of these different entities and different exposures and roll them into an umbrella, and we're going to show our clients the difference between a 1, a 2, a 3, a 5, a 10, and ultimately when you get to that page in the review, we guided to a decision to say what's the right limit. 90+% of my clients have at least a $5 million umbrella, and it's not because they're worth $5 million, it's because that just gives them $5 million of coverage before it can ever get to 1 penny of their business, their trusts or their IRAs or their 401ks. And to take it a step further, we would even preach to you this gentleman asked a question about his son, he's 31 years old. He may be worth $28 today, but he needs an umbrella. Because you know what he's going to get down the road is his 401k or ownership in the business or structure. And any attorney in town is smart enough to realize that this young man or female is going to get these assets and they'll attach themselves to any future assets. Well, just if they've got a couple $1 million of coverage, that'll protect them in their future assets. It's just part of the estate planning process. And the limit is simply buy a limit of coverage that nobody can get through. And don't let your State Farm agent say, well, what's your net worth? Doesn't matter. You need a $3 to a $5 million limit of coverage. I could sit up here and tell you, and Doug could too, about all sorts of liability cases that get up there. And this case in particular, the primary home, they've got a cabin, young kids, they use the cabin. They were younger at one point in time. Their friends come to the cabin and use the cabin. They've got boats. They've got cars. They've got a very much what I would tell you is a very uncontrollable risk in Florida. They don't live in Florida. They don't have a home in Florida, but they've got a great rental property with a boat. How do you know who your renters are? Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, if you have a large limit of coverage, Something happens on that boat that you don't even know what's going on, it's protected. The boat's protected. You know, for your financial nest egg is protected. You could have one home and 2 cars and it's just you and your spouse. You still need an umbrella because at the end of the day, something crazy might happen that you just is out of your care, custody, and control, and they're going to come after you. Doesn't take anybody 2 minutes to really figure out what somebody's worth is. And they think, well, if the client's worth $5 million, I'm going to sue him for 5. Well, that's why you have your umbrella. Protects you. It gives you a layer of protection that they can't get through to get to that $5 million in net worth. So the answer to the question is how much is enough is when you're sitting with your insurance agent or your broker, guide and look at your exposures and come up with a number that just makes sense to you for what your premium is to protect you so they can't get through. And I would tell you as you're doing your review, sorry,
No, it's all right, go ahead.
on my soapbox, but
Yeah. It's great. No, it's
Bob, as you're doing your review,
Yeah.
take a look at your homeowner's deductible.
I'm coming in tomorrow, I'm telling you.
Yeah, call me tomorrow. Ron, you know, when you're doing your review with your insurance agent, Lori, take a look at your deductibles. And just a quick state of the art. If you're not paying attention to your homeowner's coverage right now, you're going to get slammed because Minnesota is going to roofing deductibles. And I got a prospect on my desk right now. He's a doctor. He's an orthopedic surgeon. He called me because he found out he has a 2% deductible on his roof. It's a $2.8 million house. He found out he's got a $44,000 deductible on his roof. Hailstorm went by. He didn't have any damage, but that's how he discovered he wasn't paying any attention. But Pure went to roofing deductibles, and he doesn't want it. He can afford it, but he doesn't want it. So we priced out. He's got a $1,000 primary deductible and a $44,000 roof deductible. Well, we're going to take him to a $10,000 deductible. His premium's not going to change, and he's 10 times happier. It just, if you're not paying attention to your homeowner's insurance coverage right now, you're going to get a really big surprise, including your rates.
Yeah. Was there a question over here?
Yeah, so can you speak a little bit more to how much is enough? Like obviously, like what I heard you say is that if you have $1 million in assets, $1 million in umbrella is not near enough. You should be looking at 3 to 5. Yeah. These guys have 15 million in assets. Is 5 million enough, or do they need 45 million? Any more guidance around that?
Yeah, I would tell you. So in this situation, if I was to look at, when we get to the end of a conversation, it's all about rate. Everybody, it's about rate. I mean, a little green lizard selling car insurance right now that everybody in America, and nobody really knows, but damn, that lizard's cool, or the camel, or the caveman. But at the end of the conversation, you're looking at those proposals that were put together for people, and it's a $5 million umbrella might cost $900, but a $10 million umbrella might cost $1,300. And in the big world of somebody who has financial assets like this, $400 is going to make or break what he spends on his personal insurance. Not a chance, right? And if I'm smart, I'm going to talk to him about risk management. That's what we preach to our clients. Risk management 101. Take a look at your homeowner's deductible. This guy probably minimum should be a $5,000 to $10,000 deductible on those homes. And then that premium savings alone pays that umbrella coverage 3-4 times over in an annual period, just by looking at your deductible. And so when you get to that number at the end, because everything that's in this thing, the homes, the boats, the cars generates umbrella premium. And so, there's a jump, okay? The more stuff you own, the bigger the jump between 5 and 10 is. But look at the bigger number. You can't buy enough umbrella coverage, in my opinion. Does he need $20 million of coverage? Maybe. He may sleep better because he has $20 million coverage, and I have markets that can get him that. My primary markets will do up to 50 to 100 million of an umbrella. Most markets are going to do 5, but there's markets out there that will do, umbrellas over 5. But the answer to your question is it's a number that makes you sleep comfortable at night, because most claims are outside your care, custody, and control. I've got teenage kids right now. I don't have a cabin, but I have a swimming pool. And I got a daughter who's a sophomore in college, and when she comes over, her friends like to, they're not 21 yet, and as much as we try to monitor it, hey, I've come home and seen a couple empty beer cans sitting by my pool. Doesn't mean they're bad kids or anything like that, but one knuckle chuckle jumps into the shallow end and cracks his head on the bottom of my pool, and my $10 million umbrella is I sleep better at night. I have $10 million. I'm nowhere near worth $10 million. But at the end of the day, I sleep comfortably knowing I've got a big limit of coverage out there. Something happens, they're probably not getting through it. You see where I'm going with that number? It's not necessarily, it's just those numbers guide clients to the right decision, and it makes them sleep better at night. That's what I tell my clients.
David, you and I were talking earlier this evening, and you had a question that you wanted to pose. And do we have Pat over here first? Go ahead, and then we'll come back to David.
Oh, thanks. Different perspective. Aside from insuring the home and the other objects, and I'm looking at this from a different point of view. When a person dies, a lot of things happen. It shows on the sheet here he has a business worth $5 million. It's an S corporation. I take it he may be the only owner. And he's got $1.5 million loan against it. I don't know if that's the case or not, but if it is, I think the loan's going to come due. And if he's the only owner, there's a good chance that the company's going to be worth a lot less than $5 million. There could be a problem there.
Yeah.
In addition to that, you've been talking about taxes, and you're certainly right about that. It's going to take a lot of planning to reduce the taxes as much as possible. It'll take a lot of planning to get as much property to the heirs as you can, and to get as much to the kids and the grandchildren as possible. I would simply say that when a person dies, to bring some money in right away with no tax always helps. Now, these folks are making $1 million a year. They're busting their necks to give $10,000 to charity, so they might have some room. I would say she should buy $2 million of life insurance on him. He should buy $2 million of life insurance on her. Neither one will be taxed if they die. And I don't know how old they are, but if they're about 55 years old, you can do all that for about $80,000. It might pinch a little bit, but there's ways of doing it for $40,000 the first year and kind of inch it on up. It'll solve an awful lot of problems if they happen to die at the wrong time. And I think they should do a lot of these other things as well. But all these other things are not going to make much difference if they die at the wrong time financially. That's all. I
agree. The life insurance side is something that we really didn't tackle, but that's a whole nother conversation that we can and will have at some point in time, but you're absolutely correct.
I got a couple of questions back on insurance. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry about that, Bob. Question on insurance. I was talking to I'm on a home development board, and some of the questions have come up that Minnesota has ranked, or its insurance ranking has changed, especially with homeowner property. Thought maybe I'd like to get some comments about you on that. And secondly, second question would be, looking at the assets that we have here with this case study, what would you recommend they should be doing for other future planning and investments? With all that, we got 17 million in assets. What would they be doing for additional investments and income beyond just the protection?
Right. Well, it is going to be a relatively serious conversation about where they want to go at some point in time. I mean, we're kind of talking about retirement planning and how we're going to structure it for, one, where they're going to live, two, what they anticipate when they retire. And we have someone here that's kind of semi-anticipating that right now, and there's some planning that needs to go around that. And then, if where they're going to live is different than where they are now, or even if it's where they are now, do they plan to scale down their lifestyle, or are they going to increase their lifestyle? What kind of expenses they expect to have at that time frame, and what kind of lifestyle they want to live. And it's common, and you folks have experienced this before. I mean, your first, maybe 10 years of retirement are your active years. And you're likely going to spend more during those years than the following 10 years, of course, depending upon your age. And so we want to plan around those factors as well, not to mention whatever other costs that may creep into the decisions of where you're going to live and how the assets are going to be managed around that from a tax standpoint, so that we're trying to protect those assets significantly that way. But it's a longer process, and it takes time to really review the situation and all of the costs that go along with it, and recognizing, of course, it is going to be more out of your pocket. So some people say, oh, I don't have enough, because if I spend at this level for the rest of my life, I'm going to run out. And the reality of it is, our experience has been that first 10 years are real active. Next 10 or 15 years are a little lower key. They're not spending as much money. If the money is managed properly and they're withdrawing their assets at a rate of, say, 4 to 6 to sometimes 8% a year, and the assets are producing returns somewhere in the area of 6 to 8% on a regular basis, they're going to have plenty of assets to get through their lifetime. So we run some calculations on that are also tied to whatever the tax situation is and what their normal spending behavior is. And that's done with the help of these folks here who have perspectives on it that we don't necessarily have, and that's why you want to do it with the team. Yes.
Well, I wanted to answer his first question. Can I just, when you say ranking to 20, what kind of a ranking? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay,
Yeah,
so his question was in regards to the catastrophic losses that have been going on around the United States as Minnesota become more of a cap-prone state. The answer is yes. The biggest catastrophe that Minnesota faces in the summertime is hail. And you don't need to really, I mean, this is Wisconsin, but if you read in the last 60 days, Lakeville in particular was the first one, the first week of June, got destroyed by storms that came straight through the city of Lakeville, flooded the high school parking lot, cars, all of that. It was sort of a smaller path, but it switched down into Northfield along that lines. Believe it or not, they just finished the roof on my house yesterday. Second was, if you saw about 3 weeks ago, hit the sort of the Wisconsin, the Balsam Lake area, and it just sort of went through that area again a couple of days. And the answer to your question is, yeah, I mean, Minnesota's gotten, the property coverage in Minnesota's gotten killed with hail losses in the summer and ice dams in the winter. If you saw this winter, most of us probably had ice dams. Some went away with no damage to your house whatsoever, which was great. Most didn't. Most of them caused some kind of a shingle damage, which caused some kind of a leakage into your home, and which, of course, sheetrock, which leads to claims. So the answer to the question is yes. Minnesota's been getting more and more catastrophe. It's going to, my point is, we just said Chubb, and if people in this room are familiar with Chubb, they're pretty much the blue blood insurance company of the affluent world, or the more successful world. Took a 20% rate increase on homeowners July 3rd and instituted a mandatory roofing deductible, which I've been doing this for 25 years with Chubb. I about fell out of my chair in April when they told me that. That's just Chubb. They just don't do those kind of things. So it's going to be real interesting over the next 12 months as we manage our Chubb relationships as they get those rate increases delivered. We're going to have a lot of upset clients, but clients have been with them for a very long time. So, sorry, I just wanted to make sure I understood and answered this question.
Good point. David, did you want to get someone to read? Okay.
I just wanted to come back to Mark for a second on the umbrella issue.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to clarify a point I thought you made, indicating that perhaps dependents who are going to inherit might be 30 years old today, but could look to substantial assets 10, 20, 30 years down the road. Did I hear you say that they ought to be carrying umbrella policies today because of the potential for litigation to attach against future assets coming their way or something of that nature?
I believe that everybody should have an umbrella, whether they're 22 years old or 30 years old once they go off on their own. In this case, we've got kids getting married. I think they need at least $1 million of coverage, whether it's 2 or 3, because in the big picture, if you don't have the umbrella, it's just on your primary policy, so let's just say your car insurance. The minimum limit of coverage in the state of Minnesota is $30,000 for bodily injury. It's $10,000 for property damage. I think everybody in here in this room is driving a car that's got a value worth more than $10,000. So if you take a 30-year-old gets in a car accident, let's just say they're carrying the minimum limits, after they burn through the $10,000, everything over and to fix that car is coming out of their pocket. If they had an umbrella, they wouldn't have that problem. And to a 30-year-old that might have a home and let's say a home and 2 cars, $1 million umbrella average probably costs $150 a year. And so you see where my point is, it just gives them this added protection, and down the road, Doug could speak to this, but I think, unless you're protecting those assets to pass down with trusts and things along that lines, and in this situation, most of these assets are just coming right personally down the chain. Somebody could garnish any potential assets they were to get. If they didn't have the protection at the time, they'd be exposing those assets. That's how I see it.
So I don't sell insurance, and I tell every single client that I see they should have an umbrella policy, every single one. So I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I have a question on potential probate. My situation, I have assets in 3 different states. 2 of them are LLCs, and 1 of them is jointly owned with my wife and I. Our estate plan, upon the first to die, half of that goes into a trust at that point. Is that subject to probate at that point, or?
So the LLC interest would not be subject to probate in the state they're in, but if the LLC units are owned by you individually, they would be subject to probate in Minnesota if you're a Minnesota resident.
We're Wisconsin residents.
Or Wisconsin,
Yeah.
Same concept. The real property that you own it jointly?
Yes.
So that would pass to the survivor. If it's joint tenants, it would pass to the survivor at the first death, and now you've got an asset that's owned by one spouse individually. So now at the second death, if you haven't done something different with it, now that property has to go through probate in that state. And so the most common structure is to either put a revocable trust in place and have that property owned by the revocable trust, or a lot of states nowadays offer what's called a transfer on death deed. It's sort of like a beneficiary designation for real estate. And so you can record that with the county, and that can be set up to pass either to the trust at death or to an individual at death. So that's another method that can be used to sort of structure things on the front end to avoid probate in the future.
But with the second to die, that goes into trust at that point too, so that will still avoid.
Yeah, so if you set it up to say at the second death, it automatically goes into the trust, now you've avoided probate entirely.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, Jerry.
Bob, could I just, we spend a lot of time talking about long-term assets. I think everybody in this room has short-term assets, and maybe the question would be before we break up, is that, with the market at the all-time high here, and you do see what the Fed's done the last few days, that kind of thing, but maybe you just want to comment on a strategy that you, Stonebridge, are using to employ to minimize the risk when you got all these high, multiples, this market is where it is, that type of a question? Because short-term protection is obviously a big thing, I think, on a lot of people's minds.
Okay. It's on our minds, and it's in the news on a regular basis. When is the next cycle change going to happen? And when we talk about a cycle change, typically an economic cycle runs somewhere between 4 to 6 years, from bottom to top, back down to bottom. And so now we've lived through an upcycle here that's lasted for 11 years, which is longer. And the rationale behind that is that we had a very steep recession. So coming out of a steep recession like 2008, the upcycle does tend to last longer. And so if we get to the point we're at the top of the cycle, what are we doing to protect clients' assets if we slip into the other side of this cycle, which is a bear market or a down cycle on the equity side? Could be a down cycle as well on the bond side. And so we make our decisions in terms of asset allocation and the types of securities that we buy based on your individual objectives. You tell us what you're trying to accomplish with your portfolio. You tell us the amount of risk that you want to take to achieve that objective. And you tell us what kind of income needs you have, what kind of costs you have, and we kind of put all that into an idea relative to how your portfolio should be allocated between riskier assets and conservative assets to meet your overall goal. The second source of our asset allocation decision is based on market cycle. And that's when we come back to you and say, we're now in a market cycle that looks like it's topping, and quite frankly, this market cycle is topping. Real volatile. You see days where today was a 500 to 600 point swing from bottom to top, back down to bottom again. It was a big swing. We're going to see more of that as we go forward. The question we're going to first ask of you is, if we have a 30 or 40% drop in the stock market, are you going to be comfortable with that, with an asset allocation of maybe 80% of your portfolio in stocks and 20% of your portfolio in bonds? And if we have that kind of a downturn, you're going to be subject to roughly a 25 or 30% downturn in the value of your portfolio. We're certainly not going to sell at the bottom of that cycle. But how are you going to feel? How much time do you have to recover from that? Because markets go through cycles, and we see them when you see great big charts of the S&P 500. You know it goes up and down, but generally that up and down kind of goes like this. If you have a longer time frame to deal with that, you may say, I know I'm going to get my best returns in stocks as opposed to bonds. So if the market goes down, I'm fine with that. Okay. We'll try to manage that a little bit more towards the less conservative side, but we might say, well, let's do this. Let's reallocate your portfolio today, you, Mr. Long-Term View person. Let's reallocate your portfolio from 80% equities to maybe about 60% equities and give you some protection on the downside. When that downside happens, those fixed income securities, or bonds in this case, are going to come due. Then we'll have the opportunity to take that cash and reinvest again at the bottom of the market cycle and benefit from the upside. But if you're a person, you may be in your 70s, your 80s, you've been through these cycles before, you really can't afford to go through those cycles. Now, we're talking to you right now about asset protection, which is the purpose of this meeting. How aggressively should we be protecting your assets in this current market cycle? And that each one around this room here is going to have a different perspective on it. We want to know what your perspective is. And so for some of our clients who are more conservatively oriented, can't afford to go through another 2008, we're already just slowly starting to back off positions in their equity portfolios and reallocating them to fixed income, typically short-term bonds, where they're going to see a little volatility in price, but they're going to mature at a specific time, and you'll get your money back and you can reinvest. So we're reducing that level of risk, which we also want to tell you is if you've been used to 8, 9, 10, 15% returns over the course of the last 10 years, which is wonderful, when we reduce the risk of your portfolio, we've also reduced the opportunity for return. And you're likely going to be looking at returns that are closer to 3, 4, 5%. Are you going to be comfortable with that? A lot of people say, well, I don't want to do that either. I understand that. But is that better than waking up one morning and seeing your portfolio down 30%? For some of you, that doesn't matter. For others of you, you say, I can't stomach that. That won't work for me. And so it's just a matter of making sure we communicate and understand what that means for you in terms of reducing the risk of your portfolio at this particular stage of the market cycle, and is that a comfortable level for you? And we'll give you our best estimates on it. But it is, in a weird way, protecting your assets. And this conversation also needs to be shared with your tax preparer because, by the way, when we reduce the risk of your portfolio, if you've had this money to work for the last 8, 10 years in the stock market, you have significant gains in your portfolio, which is wonderful. But when we sell those companies, we sell those stocks, you're going to be subject to a capital gains tax, likely around 23%, if I'm doing my math right. So that means we have to prepare also, even though we're protecting your portfolio from the downside of the market, we also have to prepare you for the tax liability that's going to come up on April 15th. And so we need to talk through all of that process so you understand, you consume it, and you say, okay, that makes sense for me. But that asset allocation question is something that we don't do very often. We're not in and out of the market on a monthly, weekly, annual basis. This is a long-term cycle, which is really, really designed to protect your portfolios from the vagaries of the market when we have a serious bear market. That's a prolonged bear market. We felt that a little bit, and all of our guts tightened to those that were invested in the stock market in December last year. It was like, oh my gosh, Merry Christmas. The market's down 30% from its high. It felt like the bear market was starting. It wasn't. And even those of us who are professionals in it were like, we just need to be patient. It'll be fine. Take a deep breath. We know what we're doing. But at the end of the day, when you get to those situations, if you're really doing some gut wringing, We need to talk about what the real downturn is going to be, and we're not suggesting it's around the corner tomorrow. It could be 2 years out. We get a China deal, interest rates are lower, this market could run for another 2 or 3 years. But if it doesn't, what does that mean for you? So that's a long answer to a short question, but we want to make sure that we're talking each one of our clients individually to make sure what this means to them and how we should prepare the portfolio.
If you have trust agreements, how often should you have them renewed or reviewed? You know, if you had them written 15 years ago.
So it's going to depend a little bit on kind of what's happening with your family or your finances. I would say anytime you have a major life change, you know, something in the family, you sell a business, your net worth has increased substantially, you have issues with children, they got married, or they have substance abuse issues, or all of those sort of things, those are good reasons to revisit what the estate plan is. I would say, for the most part, the tax changes that are occurring don't require you to come in every time the taxes change to update your estate plan. Typically, they're drafted in a way that they're fairly flexible with that, not every time. But those are the primary reasons. I would say, you know, it's a good idea probably at least every 3 years to look at them. If you have something that happens dramatic in between there, go in and take a look at it.
We like to do annual reviews, at least annual reviews with our clients, and at that time, we're going to ask them to look at not just how their trusts are structured or their properties are structured. Have there been any new properties introduced to your life that we're unfamiliar with? Take a look at your beneficiary designations for your insurance, your retirement plans, and so on. Are there any changes that are required there? So we'd prefer, even though I understand, Doug, from a estate tax planning or whatever standpoint, 3 years is plenty, but some of these other things, they should at least be reviewed on an annual basis, so you get, unless something major, if something major has changed and you haven't prepared for it on those particular documents, you need to do so. At least that's what we prefer.
And I think that comes back to having kind of your advisory team working together, because you're going to see your investment advisor more often typically than you're going to see your attorney. But if everybody knows what everyone else is doing, you're going to spot when there are changes that should be made, and, you know, tell the client, you know, go in and see the attorney and take a fresh look at it.
So are you a team that we could come and bring our portfolio and all of you would work together and give the opinions, or are you just speaking in general when you talk?
We are a team, yes, and we have worked together, sometimes with some different members and so on. But yes, I would say it would be helpful for us that when we get a chance to meet with you, that we know if you have a team already in place, we know who they are. And frankly, I don't care if it's a competitor investment manager, right? I'd like to know that person. I'd like to know what they're doing with your portfolio so that we're doing the correct things to manage in concert with that portfolio manager. And also understand the assets that they may be placing you in. Because if they have you in a whole bunch of high-risk assets, and you saying, I love high risk, that's great. And we start plowing more high-risk assets into your portfolio because if that's what you said, we don't know that you've taken that kind of risk with your portfolio. We need to know that. So we can say, let me offer a suggestion here. Let's balance out the risk that you have here. It's not that they're bad investments. It's just that it might be better for you under certain circumstances to have a balance of more conservative assets in your portfolio. But beyond that, I mean, there's just a ton of other planning reasons.
I would add to what Doug said as well, that usually no one wants to invite Doug or I to an annual meeting because we charge for our time, you know, and that is true. That is what we do. However, in the long run, whether it's annually or biannually or every 3 years, if you do have a team and you have more complexity or things have changed, as Doug mentioned, in the long run, you're going to save yourself money and come up with a lot better ideas because you want your team on the same page. And the reality is, someone's probably going to have to call him or me or whoever your team is anyway and bring them up to speed. So it's just much more efficient and effective if you do that. And we know that, you know, they don't like to invite us. we get that. But in the long run, it's to your benefit and probably far cheaper.
Tom?
Yeah, first off, I want to thank the panel very much. This is very helpful and very valuable information. But Bob, I've got a specific question for you. You were talking about different rates of risk. And when you talk about bonds, could you speak a little bit about bond funds versus individual bonds and sort of the Stonebridge philosophy?
Yeah, it is our philosophy, and it's a bias. So I'm giving you a biased opinion, but it's after doing this stuff for 40 years, I've kind of developed those biases. We prefer to use individual securities as much as possible. So individual stocks and individual bonds. So what that means is we're literally building your investment portfolio with Nike and Apple and companies that you're buying stock in those companies. And the same is true with an individual bond. We like individual bonds because, one, we do our own credit analysis of those bonds because we want to make sure that the credit quality of the bond is appropriate for your portfolio. In a mutual fund, a bond mutual fund, you don't really know for sure what they're putting into that mutual fund, nor do you know for sure what the maturity of those bonds within that bond mutual fund might be. You could be invested in a bond mutual fund that has maturities of 20, 30 years. For some of you, that's not appropriate. The other side of using mutual funds in particular, and I'm not picking on it because we run a mutual fund as well, mutual funds are useful in certain situations where you want to get an investment in a sector of the market, or maybe you want a foreign investment in a certain country, and they're very helpful that way. But if you're using mutual funds for the general part of your portfolio, and I think Lori can support me on this, they're going to make distributions of either gains or losses at year end. They're required to by regulation. So within that mutual fund, say it's a stock mutual fund or even a bond mutual fund, they're going to turn over the companies that they own in that portfolio at least 100% every year. So they're going to sell every single stock they have in that portfolio. Once a year they're going to sell it, and once a year they're going to buy it back. There's cost of transactions in that, but there's also capital gain transactions in there. And so every year we meet with the tax preparer of our clients, and we about right at the first part of the year and near the end of the year to put a tax planning scheme together for what clients want to take in terms of capital gains or what they may want to take in capital losses relative to the gains they have outside their portfolio. So we plan our investments around that, and we can really pinpoint what kind of gains we put in place for you. And particularly at year end, you say, oh man, don't take any more gains because we just sold a property, we just sold this, and my accountants say, oh, no more of that stuff. We're done. Okay, that's fine. But if you're in a mutual fund, you can't control that. You also can't necessarily control how that manager is managing that fund. Are they taking more risk than they should? Are they in bonds that are lower credit quality and could have default, and you could lose money on that fund? So we want to be able to manage that risk for you with individual bonds, with specific maturities and credit qualities, and individual stocks that we typically plan to hold long term and not incur a lot of capital gains for you. We want to benefit from the growth of that company and the dividends they're paying. So we have a strong bias to individual securities where we can use them. Where a mutual fund makes sense, or an exchange-traded fund, which is kind of like a mutual fund, except it trades every day in the stock market like a stock, they can be very useful for certain portions of a portfolio. But for tax planning and for protecting your portfolio from the vagaries of the market, we prefer you use individual stocks and bonds.
Yeah, capital gain distributions are usually like a wild card in year-end tax planning. Even if you use similar to use the year before, it's not much more than a guess. And so some years you're a little high, and other years you're low. And no one remembers on April 15th when they owe more money that they got this capital gain distribution at the end of December. Short-term memory. So,
Yeah. Mo?
Covered Bridge, which is a mutual fund run by Stonebridge. If I go to Schwab every day and I see the return, it shows a loss, 5% or 10%. But yet when individual analysis has been done, it shows a profit. So what are you using for generally accepted accounting principles?
This, to some degree, is true with many mutual funds. The Covered Bridge Fund happens to be a fund that is designed to produce a specific level of income distributions through dividends and capital gains and income that we achieve through, I won't go into detail on this, but writing covered calls. And they produce income on a monthly basis for the fund. Quarterly now, that fund makes a distribution of all of that income. Income and capital gains are done on a quarterly basis. So when you distribute out that income and capital gains, you got to kind of think about this a little bit. You got a $10 per share fund, and you make an 8% distribution. The value of that fund is going to drop because you've distributed the cash out, you've taken the value out. In most instances, the clients say just reinvest that income back into the fund, and it's going to reinvest at a lower price, at that price that it dropped to. So if it goes from $10 a share to $9 a share, that's where the price of the fund is going to stay, at least for a period of time. What happens is you buy more shares of the fund. So the actual value that you've attained during that time frame, in other words, the number of shares times the per share value, has gone up significantly. So the total value that you have in your fund is greater than what you originally invested, but because the fund per unit price dropped down by $1 or $2, that reflects in the cost basis, and so consequently, it gives you that loss perspective. And it is all about capital gains, distributions, and income needs for our clients. That particular fund is much more appropriate for qualified plans or IRAs, 401ks, than it is for individual investors who have taxes to worry about, because this fund is going to generate tax liabilities. And we always tell clients about that. So it is just an accounting method that not just our fund utilizes, but all funds. When they make a distribution, you'll see the unit value of that mutual fund drop. They'll distribute that income and then reinvest it, and you have more shares than you had before they made the distribution. Show it on paper, it's a little easier to understand, but it is complicated. What does that mean? We're safe? What are you doing? Sometimes I get voice signals. Usually it's Laura, and she's going,
Getting the hook.
you haven't given me the hook yet, honey. I'm a little disappointed. Do we have one last question? I don't want to cut anybody out that might have a question. All right, well, I'm going to have...
Again, sort of a follow-up. Doug, I think, mentioned relative to estate planning that you might want to put in place trusts for dependents who are going to inherit, so that when the parents die and those assets, whether they go to their spouse first and then get distributed, or you split it up somehow, all those assets as they get distributed to the dependents flow down into protected trusts. Did I hear that correctly?
You did.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the most, we do it all different ways. I would say nowadays that's the most common approach, because there's a lot of ways to unwind that structure. If it turns out long-term that that's not the right approach for the child once they're an adult, there's a number of ways to do away with that trust, but you can't go the other direction. So if they inherit the assets individually, and then they say, well, I would have really preferred that trust structure because it offers all these advantages, they can't do it at that point.
Anybody else we missed? Well, you know what? In life, you're blessed with partners, and I've got, 25 of them now at Stonebridge, and it has been a blessing, and I think probably one of the greatest blessings that I have is a guy by the name of Ron Hume, who is one of the greatest partners anybody can have. So I just like Ron to come on up and just kind of wrap up the event tonight. Thanks, buddy.
Bob, that's the nicest thing.
It'll be the nicest thing you'll ever hear from me.
It is the nicest thing you've ever said.
Just don't
Thank
count
you.
on it.
So on behalf of all of us at Stonebridge, we want to thank you for being here tonight with us. You've entrusted us with a substantial amount of your money to guard and be conscious of what your goals and objectives are. I think you can tell by tonight's group that we take that very seriously. We are honored that we have a number of partners that are outside of Stonebridge that we draw on to make sure that your assets are well protected, and we can recommend where you need to go or work with your advisors, as Bob obviously alluded to. So I would like to have everybody give a round of applause for our panel tonight. A job well done, thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge our 2019, where is Mike with Goodwill Easter Seals? Mike, will you stand up? Our partner and community partner from Goodwill Easter Seals. All of us are familiar with Goodwill. We all go and drive up and we drop off the stuff that we don't want. But remember that Goodwill has more than that, and if anybody wants to make a donation when they're thinking about it, please do. Secondly, I want to thank the James J. Hill Center, which we all maybe have heard is closing for public use, and we don't know what's going to happen to it. We're pleased and honored that they honored our commitment for tonight's event. We want to thank the St. Paul Hotel and their catering staff. How was that dinner tonight? Pretty good? That's good. We also want to thank the AV4U, our audio. One of the things that I think all of us know is that when you go to an event and you can't hear, it's just a disaster. So I think we did a good job tonight, and we thank Audio for You for doing that. Bob mentioned our September 12th, Thursday night, Golden Valley invitations are going to be in the mail for that. And other than that, the bar is going to remain open. You're welcome to stay.
I want to do one quick, once again, Curly, you goofed me up here. I want to thank Yvette Mullen. Yvette's our, what do you mean, what do you mean? She's our event planner.
That's good. I'm glad you did that.
Okay, that's why we're a team.
I know.
That's what it's all about.
So besides Yvette, we want to thank Patrick Kincade for putting this whole thing together. So that was great. So the bar is going to be open. Portfolio managers and professionals from Stonebridge are still going to be here to answer any questions that you have. So don't hesitate to stay and have a cocktail. Additionally, there is materials that we have on the table outside on estate planning that we'd like you to take. Recently, one of our portfolio managers, Scott Shinnick, wrote an article on income versus principal, talking a little bit about what Bob alluded to and how to protect assets. So that article is available also. So with that, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you all.